Chapter 7. At last, school was out. Patsy, free and merry as a bird, wrote a long letter to Anne Lewis. She begged Anne to hurry and come to the village. There were so many things to do. Camp Feed Friend was getting on famously. Anne would see it was better than the boys' camp fight foe. Happy Acres was a bower of roses. They would take their knitting to the summer house every day. Anne remembered, of course, she remembered Dick's dare and double dare about their following him and finding out what he was doing. They must certainly do that. He went off every few days. No one knew where. David and Steve had tried to follow him, but Dick led them a chase like an old red fox. Cousin Mayo said for miles and miles, and then back home. It was certainly a secret, and she and Anne must find it out. And Patsy ended as she began, begging Anne to hurry and come to the village. It was such an important letter that Patsy took it to the post office herself to put it into Mr. Blair's own hand, feeling that would make it go more surely and safely than if she dropped it into the letterbox. She had to wait a while, for he was talking to Mr. Spencer, who had come in just before her. "We missed you at church yesterday," Joe said. "Mr. Blair, what's the matter? You look seedy." "It's malaria, I reckon," Mr. Spencer said in a weak, listless voice. "I stayed in bed yesterday, but I don't feel much better today." "You ought not to have got up," said Mr. Blair. "I have to crawl around and do all the work I can. Crops in the grass will. Give me 2 plow points and half a dozen bolts. I must start a plow tomorrow, and I ought to be a dozen hoe hands at the same time." "Can't you hire hands?" Mr. Spencer shook his head. "I never saw labor so scarce and unreliable. I counted on Jeff to help work the crop after I put it in. Now he's in the army, you know. You need him mighty bad at home." "Yes, but we must do without him. There's where he ought to be." "Well, if I can't get hands to chop my cotton this week, I'll have to plow it up and sow peas or something that I can raise without hoe work. Cotton is like tobacco, a gentleman crop that requires waiting on. It won't stand grass. My crop must be worked this week, or it's lost." Patsy went home, frowning to herself as she thought how sick and worried Mr. Spencer looked. At the dinner table that day, she told about seeing him and what he had said about his cotton. "Poor fellow," said Mrs. Osborne. "I hope he can get hands. It would be a serious thing for him to lose his crop." "I wish," began Patsy. "It would be a severe personal loss," said Mr. Osborne. "And these things are national calamities, too. Cotton is one of the sinews of war." "Sinews of war? What do you mean, Uncle Mayo?" asked David. "Cotton is one of the great essentials of war," explained Mr. Osborne. "Its fiber is used for tents and soldiers' uniforms and airplane wings and automobile tires. Its seed supplies food products, and fiber and seed are used in making the high explosives of modern warfare: gun cotton, nitroglycerin, cordite. Cotton is one of the great essentials of war." "What a lot of things it's good for," exclaimed Dick. Patsy spoke again, and this time she did not say "I wish." Instead, she said, "I know we could help Mr. Spencer and the war. Mother, Father, please let us do it. I'm sure Ruth and Alice and the other girls will help, and maybe the boys. We can work rows of cotton as well as rows of beans." Dick laughed. "H''M. I was just thinking we boys might get together and help Mr. Spencer. But you girls, if we all help, the 20 of us, it'll not take long to chop over Mr. Spencer's cotton," said David. He was more respectful of girls' work, since he was seeing their flourishing garden. "Good," cried Patsy, clapping her hands. "My dear," exclaimed Mrs. Osborne. "You don't mean, Patsy, are you suggesting that you girls work a crop, like common field hands?" "They're very uncommon nowadays," laughed Patsy. "That's why Mr. Spencer's cotton is in the grass." "Oh, Mother dear, he's so sick and miserable looking. We would love to save his crop, and we can, if you'll let us." "You heard what Father said. It will be patriotic as well as neighborly, with Jeff in the army, too. It'll not be a bit harder than gardening. Do say we may, Mother." Finally, it was agreed that the young folks might undertake the task. As Patsy said, if they could work rows of vegetables in a garden, They could work rows of cotton in a field. They would use light hoes, and the soil was sandy and easy to work. But it was a big job to undertake. Those acres and acres of cotton. Patsy and Dick and David went to see all the members of Camp's Feed Friend and Fight Foe, to enlist them in the little army of crop savers. They were easily persuaded. It was harder to win over their parents. The Mallets and Walthals and Geneses were unwilling to let their girls do field work like niggers, but they consented when they learned that Alice Blair and Ruth Wilson and Patsy Osborne were in the party. Whatever the Blairs and Wilsons and Osbornes did was right and proper. On Tuesday morning, the volunteer workers, with hoes on their shoulders, presented themselves to Mr. Spencer. Why, he stammered. It's awfully kind of you, but I can't let you do it. You girls, you young ladies. If the boys will help chop my cotton, and let me pay them, come on, Mr. Spencer, and do your talking while we work, laughed Patsy. Come on, you may be our overseer and boss the job. Before the morning was half over, however, they deposed him. Why? He wanted them to stop and rest every few minutes. At that rate, it would be cotton picking time before they finished chopping the crop. So they elected David Foreman. Sweet William, as water boy, trotted back and forth to supply cool drinks. And about the middle of the forenoon, he proudly invited the workers to a surprise luncheon, where each had half a dozen delicious little wild strawberries on a sycamore leaf plate. At noon they rested and ate their picnic dinner in the grove at the spring. Evening found them healthily and happily tired, and they went gladly back to work the next day. Thursday brought showers that gave them a rest, and made the freshly worked crop grow like magic. By noon on Saturday, they finished hoeing the cotton and, for the time at least, the crop was saved. On Saturday afternoon, the young workpeople loafed like real farmers, for, according to rural custom, that day was a sort of secular Sabbath, on which the men of the community rested from all their labors, and gathered sociably in the post office or on Courthouse Green. What wonderful things they had to talk about these days! Mr. Blair read the account in his daily paper of the Confederate reunion at Washington, and the President's Arlington speech. The old soldiers chuckled at hearing that foreigners, seeing the stars and bars displayed alongside the Allies' flags, asked wonderingly, "What flag is that? What new nation has entered the war?" They straightened their stooped old shoulders at the description of their 10,000 comrades, in gray suits and broad hats, marching along the avenue, and they said, with a sigh, that the story was as good almost as being there. Then they rehearsed tales of their battles and marches and sieges, and compared old feats with new. Those brilliant Canadian drives were like Jackson's charges, and like one of his messages was Foch's telegram to Joffre in the Battle of the Marne. "The enemy is attacking my flank, my rear is threatened. I am, therefore, attacking in front." The heroic, hopeless, glorious Gallipoli campaign, it was the epitome of their war of secession. As long as the world honors high courage and stanch devotion to a desperate cause, it will remember those men who, like the Franks in the old story of Roland, beat off army after army and died, defeated by their own victories, triumphing over disaster and death. "And the trench warfare they learned that from us," chuckled old Captain Anderson, "and iron ships. We showed the world a thing or two." But never had they dreamed of trenches like these stretching in long lines from the Swiss mountains to the Belgian coast, bent in and out by great attacks like the British at Neuve-Chapelle, the Germans at Verdun, and both sides in the bloody Battle of the Somme. And there were strange, new modes of warfare: U-boats hiding under seas, aircraft battling miles above the earth, tanks pushing forward, and cutting barbed wire like twine. There were many things besides fighting to discuss. America was making vast and speedy preparation for its part in the World War. Two weeks after war was declared, Congress, without a dissenting voice, voted the largest war credit in the history of the world, and there was a $2 billion issue of Liberty bonds. The government must be trying to gather up all the money in the United States, so as to have enough to carry on the war many years. So these country people said, little dreaming of the billions and billions to be raised during the next 2 years. There was the draft, too, to discuss. The selective conscription bill had passed. They were having men from the ages of 21 to 30 registered, and they were to pick and choose soldiers from these registered men. It was wonderful how calmly this supreme assertion of the government's power was accepted. There was a little opposition here and there in the Virginia mountains, in Kansas and Ohio, in New York City, but all plots were promptly and firmly quelled. The Draft Act was accepted quietly by the village. It had its sentimental, passionate devotion to the past, but now that it was being tested, it realized the living, sacred strength of the ties that bound it to the Union. It heard, with even more horror than of things over there, of outrages at home, the German plot to get Mexico to declare war against the United States, factories blown up, railroad bridges destroyed, food poisoned. Even here in Virginia, things were happening. They said loyal citizens everywhere ought to be on the lookout. There's one safe place in the world. That's the village, said old Mr. Tavis, who was sitting on the post office porch with Pete Walthall and Jake Andrews and Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith shook his head and smiled. See who comes there, he said. It's Black Mayo, Mr. Tavis said in a constrained tone. Somehow, no one understood how or why. There had grown up a feeling of constraint about Black Mayo whenever Mr. Smith was present. He's got a basket, commented Jake Andrews, and I bet there are pigeons in it. Yes, Mr. Smith. It does look foolish for a grown-up man to be raising birds and carrying them about and playing with them. Dick Osborne, who came out of the post office just then, spoke up indignantly. Why, Mr. Andrews, Cousin Mayo's training those pigeons for war. They use them to carry messages. Shucks. Jake laughed deridingly. Well, they can fetch and carry. You know, old Mr. Tavis said mildly. It's in the Bible. Noah sent a dove out of the ark, and it came to him in the evening with an olive leaf plucked off. That's all right in the Bible, said Jake. But we're talking about our days. My daddy was in the war. I never heard him tell of using pigeons. You were in the war yourself, Mr. Tavis. I ask you, is you ever sent your news by a pigeon? Mr. Tavis had to confess that he never did. And Black Mayo says they can fly 1,000 miles. Did you ever see a pigeon fly 1,000 miles, Mr. Tavis? I never went 1,000 miles myself, Mr. Tavis answered. I never did neither, said Jake. And I don't believe no pigeon ever did. Black Mayo now came up the porch steps, greeting his neighbors cordially. Hope your rheumatas is better, Mr. Tavis. Hey, Pete. Jake. How are folks at home? And your crops? Dick, you are the boy I was looking for. Here is the pigeon, a fine fellow he is, that I want you to take this afternoon for a 3 or 4 mile flight. Good. I was just starting, said Dick. What are you going to do with that other bird? Cousin Mayo. I'm going to send it to Richmond. To Richmond? What for? Asked Jake Andrews. To be set free there and fly back here, as a part of its training. Cousin Mayo, began Dick. But Pete Walthall interrupted. To fly back here? You think it'll come all that ways? He laughed incredulously. 100 miles. It was Black Mayo's turn to laugh. He'll make it in 2 or 3 hours. Why, man, I have had birds fly 900 miles. And they have been known to go 1,800, flying over 40 miles an hour. Whew. Jake Andrews whistled his unbelief, and Pete Walthall stared and laughed. That beats the dove in the ark, Mr. Tavis said doubtingly. Dick now got in his question. Cousin Mayo, aren't carrier pigeons useful in war? Certainly, and indeed they are, Mr. Osborne answered. Then, as Mr. Tavis still looked doubtful, he gave an instance. At Verdun, a company of Allied troops was cut off from the main line, and one man after another, who tried to go back for help, was shot down. At last, a basket of pigeons was found beside a dead soldier. The birds were weak, almost starved, but the men, as a desperate last chance, started them off with notes fastened to their legs. Off they flew through that curtain of fire no man could pass. The message was delivered. Forces came to rescue the trapped soldiers saved by those birds. Pete and Jake shook their heads incredulously. Mr. Tavis pondered a while, and then said, well, they could carry that note just as good as that other dove could carry the olive leaf for Noah. I am going to believe it, Mr. Mayo. "Of course," said Black Mayo. "What's the matter with you folks? Don't you always believe what I say? And why shouldn't you?" No one answered, and he went on into the post office, looking a little puzzled. Mr. Smith raised his eyebrows and glanced around with a disagreeable smile. P-R amusement, P-R statements. He himself is P-R. The drawled-out word was unfriendly and sinister. "Black Mayo is all right. All right," old Mr. Tavis said emphatically. But Pete and Jake dropped their eyes. Black Mayo Osborne was a queer fellow. They had known him all their lives. But did they really know him? Why was he playing about with birds, like a schoolboy, while other men were working their corn and cotton and tobacco? They looked askance at him as he came out of the post office and went up the street toward the roost. He found Mrs. Osborne sitting on the porch with her eyes on a book propped on the railing, and her hands busily knitting a sweater. "Howdy, Miranda. Where's David?" he asked. She looked up with a start. "Oh, it's you, Mayo," she said. "David isn't here. He's at his corn acre, I suppose. But, Mayo, come in a minute. There's something I want to speak to you about. It's Dick," she went on, as her cousin took off his broad-brimmed straw hat and settled himself on the porch step. "What about Dick?" She hesitated a minute. "The other young folks are working splendidly in their war garden." "Yes, that was a good suggestion of Anne's. The food question is serious," said Black Mayo. "Did you ever know anything like the way the price of wheat has climbed and soared? Flour is $15 a barrel, and it will go to $20 if the government doesn't get those food bills through Congress and take control. I hope it will be a good crop year. The young folks are doing a splendid work in their war gardens, and Dick not in it," said Dick's mother, frowning. "He goes off alone somewhere every chance he gets. We've never interfered with their little secrets, but this looks so selfish. We've thought of compelling him to help, but you'll not. This gardening is free will work." "Yes," Mrs. Osborne agreed, "and we've always taken the stand that after the children do their regular homework, their spare time is their own. But if Dick could be persuaded, influenced," she looked hopefully at Black Mayo. "You can do anything with him," she said. "Your word is law and gospel to all the village young folks." "I refuse to be flattered into coercing Dick," laughed Black Mayo. "If you want him spoken to, my dear Miranda, speak to him yourself." He leaned back against the porch post, stretched out his long legs, and then twisted them comfortably together. "Speak to your own erring boy." "I have done it," she said. "I tried to shame him just now. I reminded him how David and Patsy and even little sweet William are working to raise food for the hungry, suffering world. I told him about the Richmond Boy Scouts who are going on farms to save the potato crop, and he refused to be shamed. He cocked up his head with that superior, self-satisfied air, oh, big as he is. I want to slap him when he does that, and said, 'It's a nice little thing David and Patsy and the others are doing the best they can, I reckon. But I'd rather do a big thing, something to get a lot of money. Enough to buy a whole Liberty bond at a whop.' And before I could get my wits together to answer that amazing foolishness, he said he'd finished his tasks, hoed the beans, and brought in stove wood, and couldn't he go? And off he went. What would you do, Mayo?" "I think I'd do nothing," Miranda, her cousin, replied. "A boy's got to have his adventures, and Dick's a fellow that can stand a lot of letting alone. If he's on the wrong track, he's got sense enough to find it out and get on the right one. Don't worry, Miranda. Will you tell David he can get one of my plows any day he wants it? And don't you worry about Dick, Miranda," he repeated, untwining his long legs and getting up. As he started down the walk, Mrs. Osborne put aside her work and went out to the kitchen, a one-room cabin behind the Roost dwelling rooms, to speak to Emma. The old woman was standing at the door, looking worried and grum. "Why, Emma, you haven't kindled your fire," Mrs. Osborne exclaimed. Emma started. "Nom, my shoe sole was floppin'. I had to go to de shop to get it sewed on." De shop was a shed on the back way where shoes were cobbled by Lincoln Gabe. old Solomon Gabe's son. I'm going to start to fire now. Emma's voice was mournful, and as she rattled the stove lids, she shook her head and sighed dolefully. Is anything the matter? Are you sick? Mrs. Osborne asked anxiously. Nom, I ain't sick, Miss Miranda. I don't reckon I is. I ain't got no outard pains. I'm just thinkin' 'bout my boy, and wonderin' who'll get him. She went off into a confused mumble. Suddenly she turned to her mistress and said earnestly, If they take the colored folks back in slavery, I'll belong to you, won't I, Miss Miranda? Like my folks always did to your folks. What nonsense are you talking, Emma? Mrs. Osborne asked sharply. No one could put you back in slavery. No one wants to. We hate and abhor it more than you do. Why, we wouldn't have you back in slavery for anything in the world. What put such a silly notion in your head? I ain't faultin' you 'bout it, Miss Miranda. It's dem folks off yander, said Emma vaguely. They done started it. They done numbered the young bucks, and they're goin' to nominate 'em to be slaves. They're just waitin' for the orders. My boy Tom is one of 'em. Patsy, who had followed her mother, laughed and exclaimed, Why, Aunt Emma, they numbered all the men, white and colored, from 21 to 30 years old, and they are going to select soldiers from them to go and fight the Germans. Emma, some Dew has told you a lie, a wicked, silly lie, said Mrs. Osborne. There isn't a word of truth in it. As Patsy says, the white boys are going too. Why, some of them have gone. Fayette Mallard and Jeff Spencer and Will Epps boys that you know, and lots of others. They need a great many soldiers, and they are going to select them from that draft list. They say as how dem white ones was took to be officers, and bossed the colored ones till they get 'em handcuffed and back in slavery, said Emma, lowering her voice and glancing fearfully around, as if she were betraying secrets of state. Mrs. Osborne laughed. How silly. Who are they that say such foolish things? It's just bein' talked round, Emma answered evasively. It sounds like propaganda, said Mrs. Osborne, wrinkling her brow. Nom, tain't no sort o' gander. It's just talk that's goin' round. You all want some seconds batter cakes, you say, honey. And Emma went bustling about her work, deaf to all further questions.